Hey class, Dr. Robinson here, and welcome back to American and Texas Government. Hopefully you've been progressing well through your readings on the American Revolutionary experience. What we're going to do today is slow down and guide you through some of the foundational or inspirational literature behind the American Revolution. Indeed, one of the thinkers that they were citing very prolifically during the 1760s and 1770s was John Locke. And you should see on your screen here the web link that we're actually going to use in this course to guide us through portions of the second treatise of government. So to find the actual text, this is actually one of the trickier portions of this. Let's scroll on down. There's a picture of John later in life there. So under contents, come down to book 2 of government. We're not reading book 1, but book 2. This will take us down to the table of contents. And what I want you guys to focus in on are chapters 2, 3, and 4. And then chapter 19 of the dissolution of government. So let me quickly explain kind of what's going on with this text and history, and then we'll talk about it for a few minutes, okay? So this text is published, the second treatise, in 1689 to justify the Glorious Revolution. The Stuart dynasty has just been unseated. William of Orange has come in, and a limited constitutional monarchy is being established in England for the first time. So although the Magna Carta has given the barons and nobles rights dating back to the 11th century, here we're talking about sort of more formally limiting the power of the king in relation to Parliament. One of the reasons this is occurring is because of the religious dynamics going on at the time. Many of the leading members of Parliament feared that the king was attempting to convert England to a Catholic country and was going to establish an absolute monarchy with absolute control. In an attempt to prevent this, the Whigs offered 3 different times bills into Parliament that would exclude King Charles's brother from inheriting the throne after his death. So every time they did this, the king dismissed or prorogued Parliament in order to prevent them from voting on these exclusion bills. Okay, so one of the things that we believe has occurred with this text is that it's although it's published in 1689 to justify the Glorious Revolution, it's actually written probably in 1683 in defense of some of the maneuvers that are going on between Parliament and the king leading up to the Glorious Revolution. Now, the theory that the kings are using to justify their positions in this period of time is something known as the divine right of kings. They make the argument that kingship is a right that comes from God, and they can trace this back in a particular king's lineage. This was common in this literature back to Adam, right? So the king is the king of England because God gave him this power, and therefore if he wants to be an absolute monarch, it's his right and power. The modern language of rights is going to evolve out of and in opposition to this notion that the king has a right to rule through God. In the first couple chapters of John Locke here, he's going to be talking about natural rights and what rights every individual naturally would have in a state of nature. Okay? So this language of natural rights in opposition to a tyrannical king is going to well, as you can tell from the readings you've already been doing, in opposition to the tax acts and all, tax laws and all of this during the 1760s and 1770s, the language of Locke's second treatise that all men have natural rights and the king doesn't have any special right from God, we're all equal, it resounds very nicely with the Americans, and they can use Locke's arguments to develop their own arguments. So in this portion of the class, what you guys are going to do is first read John Locke's second treatise, cited prolifically by the American founders. He's really important to understanding the American identity and the American Constitution from this aspect. American individualism is very nicely summarized by Locke. Okay, just about every intro to American government, intro to American political thought will include Locke. Okay, so he's an important part of our national identity. Silas Downer's essay, the second reading assignment here, is an example of a sermon. This is actually a sermon that a minister gives publicly, orally, to his congregation in Providence, Rhode Island in 1768. What you'll notice in that Downer piece is that he is using many of the arguments that Locke develops in this first piece, and he's going to apply them to the particular dynamics of 1768. Okay? So if we all have natural rights and the king can't be tyrannical, what does this mean as far as Englishmen, right? The colonists shouldn't be treated as the subjects of English subjects, and we have natural rights regarding trade and manufacturing, and we shouldn't be subservient to the British. So hopefully you can pick those themes out of the downer piece. But right now I want to focus in on some of these themes in what is probably the more difficult to read block piece. And its difficulty arises not really from the complexity of the text, but from the fact that he's writing in 1680, and sometimes the language can be just difficult to parse. I encourage you to be patient with it. Think your way through it, okay? And I'm attempting to snippet this down to a fairly short reading exercise so that we can take our time and chew on the ideas, okay? So again, I want you to really read chapters 2, 3, and 4, State of Nature, State of War, and Slavery, and then Of the Dissolution of Government, chapter 19. What's happening here is, in the first 3 chapters that you're reading, he's laying out his theoretical argument for what he believes the proper expanse of government authority should be, and it's related to, again, how we naturally would have behaved in a state of nature. And at the end, he'll apply this to this sort of general theory to the particular circumstance of rebelling against a tyrannical king. So, when you think of a state of nature, what I want you to think about is a primordial condition of human beings running around in the woods before government and society and technology. How would we have behaved? And Locke is asking us to think about, if this is a state of nature, this is what we naturally would be like before some powerful government started bossing me around. So if I have some inalienable, inherent right from God, what would that look like? Okay? So Locke makes a case in this chapter that essentially we would have freedom, we could do whatever we please, and we'd be relatively equal. Okay? Now what this means is that, quite frankly, we're going to behave reasonably. There is a law of nature which suggests we shouldn't harm one another. It is reasonable not to do so. If we're all free and we're all equal, I mean, kind of think about this for a second. What do we need in this primordial state? Food, shelter. So if there's apples in an orchard, I can pluck one from a tree and eat it, right? It doesn't make sense to go kill the guy next door and steal his apple. It's a lot easier and safer to pluck my own and eat that one. Okay? So in a state of nature, most of us, most of the time, aren't going to harm others because there's no real reason to. Now, the next part of this summary is slightly important because he doesn't really get into it in this chapter. In his chapter on property, which is also an important part of Locke's thought, it establishes the basic idea of capitalism and private property. What he says in that chapter is, again, labor creates ownership. It's the fact that I went out and plucked that apple that makes it mine. If you want an apple, go pluck your own, right? Now, again, there's no need to steal other people's apples because they perish. If I were to go hoard all the apples and try to sell them, I'd have to do so very quickly before they all rot. Locke makes the argument that money, a non-perishable piece of metal, fundamentally changes the nature of human relations. Once we can hoard, we're no longer equal. Those who are more intelligent and savvier and stronger are going to hoard important resources. They'll sell them, okay? And here we begin to get the distinction between creditor and debtor, powerful man and weaker man, and the beginnings of the dynamics of government and kingship are going to come about, okay? So, however, when absolute monarchy, and now we're talking about chapter 4, comes about, it's a situation that's sort of like slavery, right? You get to a point, once money has been invented and kings are bossing folks around, where the natural right to own that which you have worked for no longer obtains. And Locke makes a very interesting and very good Christian argument here that because we're all the workmanship of an omnipotent God, we can't give our whole being to some other person, right? So I can't give all of my essence to some other guy and do whatever he tells me to, because I belong to God and not some other guy. So take your time on these chapters, because they develop these very interesting and profound and good arguments for why we all have natural rights, and harming one another isn't consistent with those natural rights. We just wouldn't have harmed one another in the state of nature before hoarding through the accumulation of money really gave one guy more power than the others. Now, so the state of war, Locke argues, is the opposite of a state of... If we're going to be reasonable in a state of nature, a state of war exists when someone declares that I do want to come and harm you. I am going to come steal your apple. In that context, when most of us are behaving reasonably and one of us wants to attack and be aggressive, not behave reasonably, it gives the right of war to the people being attacked. Okay? So if we're all respecting our natural rights, only taking what we have worked for and not interfering with everyone else, but somebody else does, he has violated the law of nature, which rules in the state of nature, giving us the right of war to attack him. Okay? So the crux of this argument, and it's sort of an interesting one, if somebody... Specifically, Locke makes the argument in this section, you'll see that if somebody attacks you on the street and says, I'm going to steal your horse, you have the right to kill that individual, because part of the problem here is you don't know how far he would go. If he's violating the state of nature to steal your horse, or violating the law of nature to steal your horse, maybe he would also kill you. Okay? So if somebody violates the law of nature, it gives the right of war, it gives to those who have the right of war the specific right to actually go so far as to kill the person who is doing the attacking, in the name of defense, right? So these specific arguments are applied to government. Government is designed to mimic the state of nature. If we all have natural rights and can keep what we have worked for in the state of nature, a government that we consent to would only make laws that are reminiscent of the state of nature. So if an absolute monarch or a government comes in and begins doing things that are more like the state of war, right? Taking property from us without our consent through unfair tax laws, or dismissing Parliament time and time again to prevent them from passing laws, this would be examples of somebody who is introducing a state of war through government, because the actions are we can't trust them. Okay? So in chapter 19, you're going to find Locke developing this argument. There are two broad categories that justify rebellion against a king, right? If he has violated the trust, because we don't know if he's going to do more than steal our horse, right? We don't know if he's going to pass more abominable laws than the already abominable and intolerable acts, right? So the second part of this, you see, of one, general breaking violations of trust, and then two, he gives us a specific things that the king can do. Bribing parliament members, refusing to allow parliament to meet, consorting inappropriately with another foreign king, which the English king had been doing with the French king at the time. Okay, so these are all specific things that the English king was doing in the early 1680s. That Locke is using to make the case, look, he's violated our trust. We don't know how bad of a king he's actually going to be at the end of the day. Okay. One final comment on Locke's rebellion chapter, because I've always found it interesting. When you think of a rebel, you think of somebody who is an outlaw, somebody the king is trying to get. In this chapter, Locke says the king is the rebel because he's violating the law of nature, right? So the law of nature is the supreme sovereign law. Anyone who rebels against that law is actually the outlaw. So it's funny to think about. It's an innovative use of the term rebellion to say that the king can be the rebel and we can all go get him because he's the outlaw of the state of nature, right? Locke had to be so careful with his language or so inventive, because this is a revolutionary argument. It's an argument for tyrannicide, right? And the argument to unseat kings has never really been made in the history of political thought. Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, they all said it's better to suffer under a little bit of tyranny because you never know how bad the next thing's going to be. It could be even worse. So although I'm almost out of time here and I need to stop, but I want you to leave you with that thought as you begin this text. The notion that you can rebel against the king is a revolutionary